Again, my name is Matthew Menendez with White Plume. I'll be leading the webinar today. Thank you for joining us. And we've got some fun, interesting insights that my team has pulled together from the past 3 years, working with different clients, looking at over 6.5 million encounters in our data warehouse. We have noticed some trends and some missing data that may be helpful for large orthopedic practices who are looking for opportunities to leverage their revenue cycle. Let me start with a story. I don't know how many of you are familiar with a man by the name of Mike D'Antoni. You may not know his story or his name, but if you spend any time watching NBA basketball, his fingerprints are all over the way the game is played today. So Mike grew up in West Virginia, played basketball all of his life. His dad was the local high school coach. And then he went on to college, played college ball at Marshall University. And then he was drafted in the second round of the NBA, but never really stuck. He really didn't have a successful NBA career by any measurement, cut by 2 different teams in 2 years. And so at that point, he's 23 years old, and he said, look, it was probably one of the lowest points of my life. I didn't know whether I should go back to school, get a job in the real world or continue playing basketball. He just felt kind of lost. And he eventually decided to leave the United States and went over to Italy to play professional basketball in Milan, and was there for 13 years as the point guard for that team in the European League, and then became the head coach of the team eventually. And he noticed something. He slowly introduced this new idea of how to play a different brand of basketball. It was more fast-paced. The offense was basically positionless, right? He wanted players that could play a lot of different positions and were very flexible. And eventually, he took over the head coaching job for the Phoenix Suns in 2004. He inherited a team that only won 30 games the year before, but he really understood the value of the three-pointer, and his offense took advantage of spreading out the floor and quickly finding the open shooter. And this made all the difference in the world. Instead of focusing on some of the traditional statistics and measurements like points and rebounds and steals, he introduced this concept of 7 seconds or less. He wanted his team to find the open shooter and shoot the ball in 7 seconds or less. This was his focus. He was focusing on that process, and this new metric drove the way the Suns were able to turn around their team and be successful. What they did in 1 year, they doubled the number of wins. Right? They went from a losing team to a playoff team in 1 year. They increased the number of points they scored per game by more than 21%. Mike D'Antoni and his point guard, Steve Nash, were Coach of the Year and MVP of the league that first year. Now, they never won a championship together. But if you look at what happens now, the last 4 teams today to have won the NBA championship, they all play basketball the way D'Antoni coached the Suns and the way that he kind of envisioned this, and it revolutionized the NBA. You hear them talk about space and pace. You hear them talk about position players. They are talking about Mike D'Antoni's offense. All right, now the question is, why are we talking about this? What does this have to do with running a highly productive orthopedic practice? I think that's a great question. How does this relate to me? Why are you talking about this, Matthew? Well, D'Antoni, he did a couple of things that I think we can borrow from in our thinking about how to revolutionize the revenue cycle outcomes in busy orthopedic practices. Number one, he created this new metric, and he really focused on that because he was able to use that to drive the process and change the way they played, change the way they worked. This metric could measure that process, and he would focus on that process to make it better and better and better. and it was reliably repeatable, meaning it didn't just work for the Suns, right? That's something that the Cavs and the Warriors and the Raptors could replicate on their own team to be successful. So today, we're going to look at that missing revenue cycle KPI that can drive incredible improvements for orthopedic practices. So I'm going to divide the webinar into 3 parts. We're going to talk about, number 1, what is this new metric? Number 2, explain how does it work? And then number 3, talk about, can it work for me? Can it work for each of you in your practices? What is this new metric? How does it work? And can it work for me? All right. So when I look at the landscape today, spending a lot of time over the past 20 years, working with large practices, we've seen the KPIs that revenue cycle leaders, that consultants focused on for the past 20 years are typically denial rate, charge lag, AR days. Those are the big 3. Those are the big 3 that people focus on. And most people have done a really good job of driving that down. Driving down the denial rate to where you see most practices 2, 3, 4, 5% denial rate. Excellent. Excellent denial rate. Charge lag, being able to squeeze those down, certainly for office charges to be 1, 2, maybe 3 days at the most. Surgery sometimes a bit longer, but really driving down that charge lag so that claims can go out the door quickly. And then working down those AR buckets so that there's not much left in that 90-day plus bucket. These are what we've focused on for the past 20 years. And I'm not trying to disparage them. All of those are very good metrics. You want to be top of class in all of those. But I don't think they paint the complete picture, right? Just like Mike D'Antoni was looking at points and rebounds and shooting percentage and free throws, all of those were good metrics. But to really be able to improve the process, we need to look a little bit deeper. We need to look at the process and ask ourselves some really good questions that says, okay, we've got a great denial rate. How much does it cost my practice to create that type of outcome? How much are we investing to get our denial rate to 2%? And they're difficult questions to answer. When you start to look at your team and how productive and how efficient is my team. Again, a difficult thing to track for a lot of practices. And then when you really want to be able to look at that across practice, it becomes nearly impossible. So if I don't know how productive my team is, how can I compare that to anybody else? Do I know if my team is above average, below average? How does that compare to peers? Is there an opportunity for me to improve? These are the types of questions that we started to have clients ask and that we've started to try to answer by looking through all of those encounters in our data warehouse and trying to bring some data to the table. Now, a lot has changed, obviously, for physician practices in the last 20 years. Probably the biggest thing that's changed for most people is meaningful use. Now, a lot of people expected meaningful use to kind of fully automate the revenue cycle, right? We don't have those, most practices don't have paper super bills anymore. They've automated parts of that process. They thought that was all going to just work automagically. But for many people, that hasn't been the case. And so I'm going to start our first polling question and go ahead and just kind of get your toes wet on this and get your input on how meaningful use or how the adoption of EHR has impacted the revenue cycle at your practice. All right, so take just a minute and look at the choices on your screen. You should have a couple of different choices. You can just choose one. Choose the one that is most accurate for your particular practice. So all you have to do is click it, hit submit, and I'll share those results with you so that you can kind of get a feel for what that looks like across the practice. So y'all are doing a great job. I can see kind of those answers coming in. So I'll give you just another 10 seconds or so, and then I'll share the results with everybody. And I'll kind of give you some context too of what I've heard from prior times I've done this webinar and done this webinar for other specialties, so that you have an idea of what that looks like. Okay, so let me go ahead and close the polling question. So thank you for everybody for submitting your answers. And we've got probably close to 25% that said no change. You know, our doctors are still using paper super bills for that. About 50% say that our doctors are using the templates and that saves our coders some time. And about 25% say the doctors use the EHR templates, but we're spending more time from a coding perspective. So the good news here, guys, for some of you is you're doing better than what I've seen in the past. The group today, typically what I see is 85%. Well, we've done this webinar about 6 times. 85% of practices say physicians are using their templates, but coders are spending more time reviewing that coding data. All right, they're having to go behind the doctors, make corrections. For some of you, that's saving you time. Others are still using those paper super bills. You know, there are certainly opportunities to improve coder productivity in both of those categories, but the largest chunk where I typically see groups are in that third category. So just to give you an idea, 25% using paper super bills, 50% using EHR templates and it's saving coder time, 25% doctors using EHR templates, but they're spending more time. Just to get a feel for where your peers on the webinar today, where they're answering that type of polling question. You know, another thing that we look at thinking about the impact of meaningful use is a lot of people are looking to probably hire additional coders over the next 12 months. These are people in the coding billing workflow. So let me launch our second polling question. Don't worry, we're not going to have 2 of these every slide. But just to get a finger on the pulse of what that looks like over the next year is how many billers and coders do you expect to have at this time next year? Well, you have the same number with the same people, probably have the same number, but with some turnover. Do you expect to have fewer billers and coders this time next year? Or maybe you expect to have a net increase in the number of coders next year. So guys, you guys are doing a great job on these polls. Y'all are answering them quickly. I'll leave this one open for another probably 10 seconds or so get those answers locked in. You know, early results, the top answer is the same number. There'll be some turnover. There are some people that expect there won't be any turnover over the next year. They're kind of balancing out a little bit. Right now, I'll give you another 5 seconds, and then I'll close the polling question. But we're pretty close to a third in the same number with the same people, same number with turnover, or more billers and coders. There were just a couple of people who said we'll probably have fewer billers and coders next year. So you're probably pretty similar to what I've seen when we've done this webinar before. 40% of practices expect to hire coders over the next 12 months. For the folks on the webinar today, we're closer to 60%. Some of that will be through turnover. Some of that will be through net new coders and billers that they need to hire over the next 12 months. But when you think about this, what's happened is, you know, coders and billers have increased significantly at practices over the last 6, 7, 8 years. As people continue to hire, there was a shortage of them after ICD-10. That had an impact on coding staffing levels and coder productivity levels. And there's expected to be a shortage over the next 3, 4 years because there will be double-digit increases in hiring needs, is the projection from the Bureau of Labor Statistics for coders in medical practices. So you're probably in a similar boat with a lot of other people across the country, that people will be looking to hire billers and coders. There's a shortage of them. So that means if you do have a hiring need, you're probably going to be hiring that person away from another practice, right? The person who you're going to put into that job the next time probably already has a job, and that puts some upward pressure on the coder and biller salaries. Is what we expect to see over the next 2 to 3 years. So I thought it'd be helpful to kind of share that with you as we start to think about coder and biller productivity and what types of KPIs we need to look at. You know, what is this missing revenue cycle KPI that I'm talking about? So that's one of the challenges. The other challenge that I hear a lot of practices talk about is they say, you know, the coding process is a black box. It's really hard for me to get, as a leader, to get visibility into what's happening there. You know, I can't see it. I can't put my hands on it. I know that I've got really good people on my coding team. I know that I've got people that are experienced, that they do a good job. We have a low denial rate. But when I try to look at what actually is happening on that process, it's very difficult. And because I don't have good visibility into that process, it makes it really hard for me to benchmark, to know how my team is doing internally, right? I think I know who kind of the most productive person on my team is, but it's really hard for me to quantify it. I think I know how we stack up compared to some of the other practices that I talk to at AAOE, but it's hard for me to measure that. And then the really tricky part is I know who my most productive person is, but if I ever lost them, I have a significant risk to my practice because it's going to take me a long time to recruit, hire, train, and onboard someone to take their spot. And so these are some of the challenges that we started looking at and talking through, wrestling through this with other of our White Plume clients. And what we came up with was a new metric that really looked at this coder biller productivity. It was a productivity metric, and it would look at it in this way. Call it encounters per coder per hour. And what we're trying to do is look at their productivity, understand how many encounters the average coder can process on an hourly basis. Now, it's obviously very, very complicated because you've got office charges and you've got surgeries. You've got some doctors are better than others. You've got some subspecialists that code a little bit differently. How many different payers do you have? It's a complicated metric, but when you look at that over hundreds of practices, you know, and over 1,000 coders, the picture starts to become more clear. And it allows us to look at coder performance and productivity within a practice so that we can see how we're doing. We can see where there might be opportunities for improvement. We can look at that and compare that to average productivity across practices or within a specialty, right? So that we can start to not use this as a punitive tool, but to really use it as an opportunity to understand performance, to be able to benchmark performance, and to be able to look for opportunities for improvement. Right? That's what we're after. Right? Is how do we partner with practices to help them measure coder productivity and then ultimately improve it. And let me show you why we think this is so important. Just to give you a quick example, let me show you what is a typical average practice and how that compares to a top performing practice. I think this will help kind of paint that picture for you. If you look at a normal sized, large orthopedic practice that has 30 providers, and on average, they see 900 encounters per day for the practice. And they have done a great job over the last 20 years of really driving down that denial rate, right? They use a combination of tools and excellent people, good processes, and they get that denial rate down to 2%, right? Well done. We'll celebrate that all day long, every day. Charge lag, 2 days on average. They may have some doctors that are a little bit worse at that than others, but on average it's two days of charge lag, right? So these practices look identical so far. But here's where the difference starts to come in. When you start to look at coder, and sometimes I'll include the word biller, productivity here, that's where you start to see a difference. The average practice may be able to handle 30 encounters per coder per hour. And the top performing practice is at 135 encounters per coder per hour. They are much more efficient. They are much more productive, right? And when I think about this charge review process and the amount of time that they are investing in it, right, the amount of their coders' time that they're spending on that, the average practice is spending 3.75, full-time coders, right? So what that means is that's about 30 hours per day to generate that type of outcome. The top performing practice spends less than 8 hours per day on that part of the process. And that means that their coders are able to be more efficient, they're able to be more productive, and they're able to take on other tasks in the practice that the average practice can't get to. And that time savings, when you look at that all day, every day for a large practice, is significant. Right? That's over $200,000 of operating income on an annualized basis. And so for practices that are trying to remain independent, putting that type of revenue on the bottom line, that type of income on the bottom line is significant. For practices that are looking at maybe a private equity transition in the coming years, that has a tremendous impact on their enterprise value, right? That can be into several $1 million when you look at the type of improvement that makes from an EBITDA perspective. And so what we see is the practices that start to measure this can be much more efficient and much more productive than the practices that do not. And so when I talk about what is the revenue cycle KPI that we're missing, it's encounters per coder per hour. And so the first thing that you want to think about is, where am I? Where am I today? Have we ever thought about this before? Is this something that we've measured? What is my baseline? And then what is my potential? Where can I get? What's possible? And so that's where I want to spend some of our time today, is thinking through that process. How do I understand what my baseline is? And how do I understand what my potential might be? And how do I get there? How do I move from 30 encounters an hour to 90? Or to 120? Or maybe even to 150? How do we do that? And so we've worked with a lot of practices kind of through this process by providing some of the data that the manager needs to be able to understand where they are today, what is the baseline. And if that's something that you've got questions on, happy to share kind of a calculator that we have with you. Just send you a couple of questions, and we can calculate what your baseline is today and what we think your potential might be. So if that's something that you don't know, that you haven't thought through before, we can probably help you with that. It'll take you about 10 minutes, and there's no charge for that. So if that's something you're interested in, let us know. We'll make sure that we take care of that for you. But once you understand what your baseline is, we want to be able to make that improvement. And remember, I talked about what is the metric, how it works, and can it work for me? We've talked about what it is. I want to spend a fair amount of our time on how it works, right? How do we move from 30 to 90 or 30 to 120? Let's take a look at that. And it's not a silver bullet. It is not like a one single thing. There are always a lot of different factors. And I'm a big believer in, if you want to improve coder productivity, if you want to improve anything, it's usually a combination of excellent people, strong technology, and a great process. Excellent people, strong technology, and a great process. And this is where we partner with our clients. We work with their team of coders. We work with their existing technology and bring some of our own. But if you do those two things and you don't have the process, you're not going to get the results that you're after, right? Nobody needs another piece of software, right? What you really want is the outcome. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the technology piece of it. Yes, like our tools work with your existing EHR and PM systems. We do excellent support for the users. Our clients love us. But really what we need is the supporting process in order to be able to make that work. And so what I'm going to spend a lot of our time talking about today is the process. How do we do that? We've got our own methodology that we take our clients through by analyzing the data and being able to put these types of processes in place. But what we have to be able to do is think about the process and make some process changes if we want to get that type of outcome. If we want to move from 30 encounters an hour to 90 encounters an hour, we have to have an excellent process. And that starts with the data. It starts with knowing where your baseline is and where there might be opportunities for improvement. So let me just share a couple of things that I've worked on recently with clients. Here's part of the data that we have looked at. And what you're seeing here is, all right, when I've got encounter data that's coming in, from the EHR, right? This particular practice, they'll remain nameless, but this particular practice has data coming in from their EHR, coming into our application. We work with them through an interface to pull all that encounter data in. But what we know is 49% of the encounters that come in from the clinical team are clean encounters. They are coded correctly. They are coded accurately. There's nothing that needs to be changed or nothing that needs to be done on those encounters. Now, when we look across our entire data warehouse, our entire client base, on average, what we see are 52% of encounters require some sort of post-encounter coding change, right? So that means 52% of the encounters, my coders need to touch and they need to make some sort of correction. They could be adding a modifier. They could be splitting out line items. They might be making a payer-specific type change, but there are 52% of the encounters that they need to make a correction on, and that means that conversely, 48% of those are clean. So this is well representative of what we see across the entire kind of client landscape. Now, that next bucket, that light blue that you see there, 14%, that bucket represents coding changes that can be made automatically, right? So when we're talking here about this 14%, those are coding changes that can be made automatically. That's really good news, right? That means I don't necessarily have to have a coder or biller touch it to make that type of correction. Now, the gray area where I see right here, 19%, that's where I need my coder brain power to kick in. That's where I need some good decision making to be able to make those types of corrections so that we can have that super low denial rate of 2%. That's what's happening in that 19% in that gray area that you see there in the middle. I'm going to skip over the peach there for a second because it's such a small area, but I'm going to look at that last area, that orange at the end, that 15%, because this is the area that I would tell you is part of the secret sauce for the coding process if you want to have a super productive team. And what this 15% means is these are encounters where my coders are looking through, they're reviewing each encounter, they're finding problems, and they're correcting them. They're finding problems and then correcting them. And the challenge there is that 15%, that last 15%, that is what causes them to be less productive than some of their peers. That last 15%, because those are the ones, what it means is they're looking through all of these encounters to find the last 15%. They're reviewing 100% to find 15%. Now that's a challenge because we don't want the 15% to go out the door. That would make my denial rate skyrocket. But I also don't want my coders to have to look at every single one. So the part of the process that we have to go through with our clients side by side to improve the process is say, how do I move that last 15% from the orange to the gray? How do I capture that? Because if I can shrink that down, I can improve my coder productivity. And that's just one of the ways that we do it. But if you're able to actually kind of look at this on a by user basis, I changed it just to user 1 through user 5 to take out the coders' names that are working on this particular project with us right now. But what you see is user 5 is super productive, right? From an encounter volume perspective, that is the workhorse on the team. And that is a super valuable coder. And this data is very powerful for the coding manager at this particular group. Because this allows us to get some granular data. It allows us to see what my team is doing, see who's most productive, see what types of changes they're making, see what types of changes they're making for which doctor. Right? That's the data that I want to see. And I can see how their encounters fit into those buckets as well, so that we can then start to work on the process. Another way of looking at the data is looking at the encounters per hour per user. This is where you're starting to see that encounters per hour per coder metric for individual coders on my team, right? And you can see the encounter change rate, right? What percentage of encounters are they making changes on? What types of changes are they? What's the encounter volume? I've got to be able to get my hands on this data if I want to be able to measure my team's productivity and if I want to be able to improve my team's productivity. Right? This is how you move from 30 to 60 to 90. Is by starting to work through this process, being able to identify what types of changes are being made, what makes up that last 15%, and then I can work with the coding team to understand how we can start to fix it. We can understand where I can start to be more productive, right? Because that's when we go to work and say, great, good news team. We've got 63% of our encounters in those 2 blue areas that we don't have to touch. We've got 34% that we do need to make changes on. It's going to require my coders to do that type of work and to make those types of decisions. But right now, I'm reviewing 100% of the data. I'm reviewing all of those encounters. If I can leverage the data and work together with the team to build that exception-only process, then my team only has to look at the 34%. And you know what that does? That frees up their time from the 63%. That makes them 3 times more productive than they are today. So when I start to look at how do I improve coder productivity, having the data and understanding what my team is doing, what types of changes are they making? How frequently are they making changes? Are they diagnosis changes? Are they CPT changes? Are they modifier changes? Are they deleting line items? Are they adding line items? Getting down to a very granular level and understanding the data is fundamental in being able to make that type of improvement. The data allows me to do that. And that's the part of the technology stack that you need. Right? That's where some of the white Plume secret sauce comes in from a technology and from a process perspective. But also, I've talked a lot about the numbers, but there's also a human side to this. Think about the people that do this work on your team all day, every day. It's not a particularly glamorous, part of the process. But if they don't do an excellent job, It's like being a goalie in soccer. If they don't do an excellent job back there and stop every shot, prevent every denial, the cash flow for the practice really suffers. And so think about the people. When we think about improving coder productivity, it's not just about cold hard numbers. I want you to think about, how do I make the best people on my team, how do I make them even better? Think about two coders on your team. I'll call them Alice and Barbara, right? And we divide up the work. And you may know off the top of your head, a lot of times when we start to get our hands around the data, we usually hear one of two responses from the administrator or the CFO or the revenue cycle director, kind of whoever's leading that team. A lot of times we hear, I knew it. I knew it. Their intuition was validated by the data. They knew who some of the top performers on their team were, and they could now finally put numbers to it. But other times they're surprised. But I want you to think about it from Alice and Barbara's perspective. If they each have to work 100 encounters, like the practice that we just saw, that data that I shared with you, and they each have that 48% change rate, right? They each have 15% of the changes that could be automated. Right? They divide out the work equally. But here's where the difference comes in. Barbara still has that old process. Barbara still reviews every single one of those encounters, right? Because she was trying to find that last 15%. She's really good at it. She doesn't have a lot that slips through the cracks, but that means that she handles and can process 30 encounters an hour. So those 100 encounters takes her just over 3 hours to do the work. Right? Now, Alice, she's changed her process. Right? She's working through that exception-only process now. And she only reviews 34 encounters. She leverages software to make sure that works really well. She's tuned that last 15% to the point that she only has to look at the ones that have problems. So she spends all of her time fixing the problems, not looking for problems. Right? That's what makes Alice 3 times more productive than Barbara. Now, my question is, when we think about that, not just from a productivity perspective, but when we think about that from an employee engagement perspective, who enjoys their job more? Right? Who's more engaged? Who's operating kind of at peak performance levels and is able to make the big difference for the practice, to feel like their work really matters? I'm not just looking through 100 encounters trying to find the 34 that need my attention. Right? I am laser focused on the 34 encounters that need my expertise. Right? That energizes me. Right? You may not be exactly like me, but that makes me want to do that job in the morning. It says that's where I need to spend my time. That's where I need to spend my attention. I'm not wasting my time looking for problems. I'm fixing them. Right? Now, for some people who've been in those positions for a long period of time, we might have to redefine what success means in that position, or redefine what some of the KPIs are for that coder position. Right? Some people may have been trained long ago that says, I have to review every single one of those 100 encounters because none of them are going out the door on my watch without my eyeballs being on them. Right? And if you were 20 years ago, that was the only way to do it. Right? But if that's what our process looks like today, it's not nearly as productive as some of your peers, right? It's not nearly as productive as it could be. And so for some of those people, we may have to redefine what success in that job looks like and what the new KPIs are, and then they can be more successful. Then they can be more engaged, right? Then they can enjoy their job more and deliver better results for the practice, right? And that's what we're all after. You know, and when I think about the people, the other part of this is it gives management and the leaders in the practice the tools that you need and the data that you need to be able to help the coders, right? You know, coders have some special knowledge, some expertise that not everybody has, right? Not everybody can do that job, can sit in their seat. And if you're trying to lead that team, you're trying to manage that team, and you're not a coder yourself, it can be really difficult to feel like you're actually able to help them and equip them to be successful, right? I've seen a lot of practices that are kind of in that boat. The leader thinks they can be more productive. The manager wants the team to be more productive, but they don't know how to do it because that coding process feels like a black box to them. So it's not just about technology, right? It's more about the process and making that process better for the people so that those people can enjoy their job, they can be excellent at their job, and they can deliver outstanding outcomes for the practice. Not just on the denial rate, not just on AR days, but in coder productivity, right? That's the new metric that we're going to focus on, that we're working with our clients to focus on going forward. So when we think about the people and the process and the technology, they all have to be working together to deliver that type of outcome. You know, so my question is, and going back to this, when you think about what is the metric and how do I make that better, my question for you is, what's your baseline and what's your potential? So let me go ahead, before I share some statistics and some data on that, let me launch our next poll question. And remember, nobody's going to see your individual outcome, your individual answer, but I'll share the results with the group. But where are you today? How many encounters per hour can your coders process? Some of you, this may be a metric that you don't track. You've never done the math before. And if that's the case, no problem. Just use the not sure answer down there at the bottom. But if it's something that you do know, go ahead and answer that so I can share that with the rest of the audience today, so that everybody will have a bit of a feel for what other groups are doing out there. I'll give you another 10 seconds or so to lock in those answers, and then I'll share the results with the audience. Hey, you guys are doing awesome on this so far. Most of you think that you're measuring this today. We've got probably about 20% that are not sure, but most people are think that they know how they're doing today, which is great. That's the first step, is knowing what your baseline is. So thank you for answering the polling question. Ended up about 15% were not sure. So 85% of you are measuring this today. So kudos to you on that. Now, about half of you are in the less than 50 encounters per hour. 15% are in the 50 to 75. Another 20% are between 75 and 100. So very good job knowing what that looks like. Let me share with you. Again, we've looked at a couple of hundred practices with this data, and what we see is the industry average, not orthopedic specific, but all practices, all specialties, surgical, primary care. You put everybody together. The average encounter per coder per hour is 25. So that says the average practice, the average coder can handle 25 encounters per hour per coder. Now, when I look across the white Plume average, if I look at just white Plume clients, right? We've got about 150, 160 clients that we work with today. You know, orthopedics is our largest single specialty, but we work with plenty of multi-specialty practices as well. Our average white plume client can handle 141 encounters per coder per hour. And we've been working with our clients to try to improve that. So we would expect that to be higher than the national average. But just to give you some context, for those of you, the majority of you who are thinking about that or can kind of measure that today, give you a couple of benchmarks that you can use to see where you are today and what might be possible, what that potential might be. So what we see when we look at this is we know that for most people, there is significant room for improvement, right? For most people, the average practice out there may be at 25. You may be twice the average. You may be at 50, right? There's still significant room for improvement when you start to spend time and attention on the people, the process, the technology to drive that metric higher. And it has significant impact from a cash flow perspective for the practices that do. So when we start to look at, you know, what were the questions that we wanted to answer at the beginning of the webinar? What is this new metric, right? How does it work? You know, we just touched on that. There's a lot more behind the scenes to make that happen. But the real question is, can it work for you? Can it make a difference for your practice? And so I would submit to you that, yes, it can, right? We've seen this with our clients. You can go from 25 encounters an hour to 141 encounters per hour. Other people are doing it across a variety of specialties with a variety of EHRs in a variety of settings. And I share another kind of encouraging success story with you as you start to think about, is this something that my practice might be able to do if we focused on it? Over the past year, look at 2018, you know, we worked with a lot of clients on engagements, on projects to try to drive that coder productivity number higher. At the beginning of 2018, our client average was 90 encounters per hour. You know, very good, right? You know, over 3 times more productive than the industry average. But over those 12 months, the client average increased by 57% to that 141 encounters per coder per hour number that we talked about. You know, that is significant gain. You know, that's a hard thing to do across a large sized sample. And a lot of that credit goes to the practice executives and leadership and administrators at those particular practices to be able to recognize the opportunity to make their people more productive and to help them get better. And I can share just kind of one, you know, quick story with you from another orthopedic practice, the orthopedic group down in Mobile, Alabama. They were spending basically 36 hours of coding time per day because they're a good example based on what we talked about earlier. They were looking and reviewing and touching every single one, trying to make those types of changes. And their team were able to come together and collaborate and work with the White Plume team to automate more of those changes, to understand how to focus the coders' time and attention to where they now spend 4.5 hours per day to do that same type of work. They became 8 times more productive in a 3-month project. And it didn't change their denial rate one bit. They were excellent from a denial rate perspective at the beginning of this process. They were excellent at their denial rate at the end of the process. What changed is that they became excellent in their productivity through that process. So I would tell you there are hundreds of practices who have been successful at this. Even practices that are highly productive typically can see a significant improvement by focusing on their people, their process, their technology. And by doing that, it has a significant financial impact to the practice. Many of you are ahead of the game in that you're starting to track this metric already. You think you may know where your baseline is, right? And I'm happy to share that data with you, some of our experience. If you're interested in that type of calculator, I'm happy to kind of walk you through that process. This is where we spend our time, energy, and attention. We were founded 20 years ago, privately held, headquartered in Birmingham, Alabama, if you're wondering where my accent comes from. But we work with over 5,000 providers across the country. Orthopedics is our largest specialty, and the average client size is about 25 providers in the practice. So if you are interested in delivering those types of world-class coding outcomes using your existing EHR and PM systems, that's where we spend, our time and energy and attention, and would welcome the opportunity to work with you guys on that if that's something that's helpful for you. I'm going to launch our last polling question for you. It'll save you a little bit of time in the questions panel. If there's follow-up information that you're interested in, this one you can select more than one option, right? So this is not just single choice. If there are multiple options that you'd like, just check all of the ones that you'd like, and I'll make sure that we get you that information after the webinar is over. So the encounter per hour calculator gives you a good idea of where your baseline is and shows you what your potential might be based on a few questions. The PowerPoint slides are obviously the slides that I used today. And then if you want, we've recorded the audio and video of the webinar. So if you want the YouTube link for that, I'd be happy to send that to you as well. So I'm going to give you about 5 more seconds, and then I'm going to close that polling question. And I'm going to open up the, I'm going to look at the questions panel for any questions that people submitted that might be good for the whole group. For people who asked for resources in the polling questions panel, I'll make sure that I get those to you. Somebody asked about the kind of the analytics data that I was showing about which buckets certain encounters fit in. One of the things that we do, obviously we're a software company. We sell software that works alongside the EHR and PM systems, that helps with that coding process. But one thing that we found incredibly valuable is being able to look at the data on a very granular level about what types of coding changes are being made, who's making them, for which doctor. Being able to get our hands on that type of data is what makes the difference, right? If you just have a tool without any data, it's very hard to actually change any behavior or change any sort of outcome. So I showed you just a couple of quick highlights of what some of that data is and where that's helpful in changing behavior and changing outcomes. Just because we had a hour-long webinar today, didn't have time to go through all of that exhaustively, but I wanted to get you a flavor for what that looks like and how practices like yours leverage that data. So great question. Looks like most of the other questions are practice specific, so I'll make sure we handle those offline, and we're also running right up against the top of the hour, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So thank you again for coming today. Just a reminder, there is the short 3-question survey after you exit the webinar. Please fill that out. That is very, very helpful for me to continue to make sure that future webinars are productive and are as helpful as possible. So thank you again for your time today. I hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday. Bye-bye.